Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this really important session titled Blended Finance, the Broken Promise and How to Fix It. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI Global. Blended finance was envisioned as a transformative approach. The idea was to mobilize additional capital for sustainable development, and the idea was to leverage public funds to de-risk investment, to attract more commercial capital. And in fact, we have seen the blended finance market grow. In 2023, it reached $15 billion of annual flows, and that was a 5-year high. But at the same time, we've also seen the financial gap to meet the Sustainable Development Goal, the SDG, continue to grow. Last year, the gap was amounting to a staggering $4.2 billion. So you see the difference between what the blended market is and what the SDGs gap is. And so the economies, particularly in emerging markets, developing economies, remain really evident on fossil fuels. That's something else we haven't managed to improve. Renewable energy projects are far more expensive than in developed economies. And this is a really critical barrier to progress. At COP29 in Baku last year, the global community agreed to triple annual financial support to developing nations, as they're called in the Paris Agreement. That's the taxonomy. It committed to a funding target, was of $100 billion. They committed to increase that to $300 billion, and also to establish a goal to mobilize $1.3 trillion annually by integrated public and private financial sources. But this really hinges on rethinking, redoing the international financial architecture. We can't do that if we don't manage to find ways to de-risk this investment in the emerging markets and developing economies. So to scale up investment, the only way is to enable this broader systemic change. And that's what we want to discuss today. And I've got a fantastic panel to help think of how we achieve this systemic change that we talk about so much. I'll start to my left to introduce Hayashi Nobumitsu, the governor of Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Next to Nobu is Odile Renaud-Bassot, president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD. Leila Fori, Group Chief Executive Officer of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And last but not least, John Johnson, the Chief Executive Officer of Pension Customers Administration, or PKA. Odile, I'll start with you, because we've had this conversation together a few times, and I know how much EBRD is doing. There's been a lot of discussion on the role of multilateral development banks in how they need to change in the international financial architecture and how they can really help mobilize this private sector capital by de-risking it. EBRD has innovated a lot in this space. Can you share what practical steps you think MDBs can take to mobilize this commercial capital? What kind of co-investment models of de-risking mechanisms you have seen that you think are really promising?
So thank you very much for this question, and thank you for inviting me in the panel. And indeed, I think that's a very, very topical discussion. It's a long-term discussion. It's and there is no, I think, one quick fix and one easy solution. I think it's important not only, the blended finance piece and the volume of financing is, of course, a very important element, and we know how important it is in the COP discussion to build the confidence that there will be the financing available and so forth. But I think that if we really want to make progress, we need to look at the whole picture, because and that's very much where MDBs also can contribute, and because all this, sorting out the climate issue is not only, and developing, is not only about volume, it's also about implementing the right policies, implementing the right strategies that will unlock investment opportunities, that will unlock a lot of projects in which to invest. So I think the first key part is the fact that if we look at the climate ambition, now all MDBs are at the core of the way they define their mandate and their objectives. So everybody has stepped up the level of ambition, and the way we integrate these objectives in all our financing and approach. The second point I wanted to make is MDBs per se are the model of MDBs is a bit of the core blended finance in the sense that you have public money, shareholder capital, which leverage private financing because we all issue funding and then they multiply our capital. So we have a limited capital and we really invest much more than the, and that's the core of the business model, but of course we need to go even beyond. To come back to the first point I was making about the importance to have an encompassing approach to that, I think a big part of the role of the MDBs in the debate is to work on the policies that are relevant, that will give the visibility and the confidence of the private sector to invest in the countries. And that's something which, if you look at the climate space, for example, working on the strategy, having clear policy direction with policy plans to green the energy sector, to decarbonize the economy, to deal with adaptation. This is a very clear fundamental component if you want to first be able to develop projects and then attract private investors, because then you have clarity. You need to have also part of it is having, transparent, credible, sound investment framework, and then this gives confidence for people putting their money in the country that this is part of the long-term strategy. The policy will not change in 6 months, and they have visibility of what will be, where the country is going. The second point, the second role for us is really to bring, as you were saying, some concessional funding with our investment in order to leverage. And we do that a lot with climate funds. There are some climate funds have been set up at the international level, the Green Climate Fund, CIF, the Capital Instrument Fund at the World Bank, and with its really grant financing that are used to leverage and to increase our potential of financing and bring to the country or to the client the appropriate mix between concessional funding and more commercial funding. The last point, I think, is really for us to work on with private sector investors in order to bring them co-investing with us. And there are, we work on a number of different type of instruments. The more traditional one is B-lending, B-lenders we have, and there, this is a very useful instrument. What we see is that the regulatory tightening of in the bank regulation and so forth has quite reduced the appetite of the banking sector to do that. Asset managers may be more interested and have more capacities, but we need, this is one limited instrument. We need to go much beyond. Developing local capital market, I think, is a very important dimension, and for 2 reasons. The first one is that you have a lot of savings which is not invested in the countries, which is going abroad, and mobilizing local saving is a very important component of financing the development of the country. The second element is that it really helps also to bring financing in local currencies and being able to match and to reduce the exchange rate risk, which is one element of the challenge. This is very important. But of course, we are also working on some risk-sharing approach, first loss PCs, and so forth. What I found is that very often this is seen as the solution, but when you look to scale it at a very wide scale, it's extremely expensive. So you need a lot of concessional funding in order to be able to cover the risk. So that's why it's not, I think it's relevant in some pieces when you're, in particular, are very early markets, highly risky new technologies and so forth, but it cannot be a widespread, it will not be the solution to finance emerging, SDGs globally.
Thanks, Odile. So we've heard the perspective of an MDB from Odile, but DFIs are also a very important component, a critical component of the global financial architecture. Now, can you tell us a little bit about how JBIC has adapted its risk-taking activities to try and continue mobilizing capital at scale in emerging markets and developing economies?
Well, we are JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. We used to be called Exim Bank of Japan, but as our universe has expanded more than export and import to more and more investment, we are called JBIC now. And in this world of disruption and division, as our mission is to support Japanese companies' activities overseas, it's getting more and more difficult for them to adapt to energy transformation and supply chain disruption. So we have to be innovative in terms of adopting technology and in terms of taking more risks and in terms of collaboration with other our counterparts in other countries or collaborating with the NDBs. And oftentimes our challenge is less about how to find financing, but more about the regulatory framework or about the ability of the host countries to execute those projects. And an enormous amount of money of financing is needed, especially in Asian countries, as they grow and as they decarbonize. Well, we've been talking about decarbonization, but in Asia, the reality is that they continue to use fossil fuel. A lot of coal power is still there, which are still very new. So we continue to work with them how they can decarbonize using gas in transition, but using more renewable energy and strengthening the grid. These are a lot of policy issues involved, the capacity issues involved, regulatory framework issues involved. So in such Asian countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, we set up a working team with the governments, with the government agencies, and with Japanese companies, so that as we develop a certain real project, we advise those governments to improve their regulatory framework, so that hopefully when the project is ready, the framework is also improved. That is how we try to work with those countries. But these are what we can do in Southeast Asian context. In other parts of the world, we have to ask our partners, other bilateral agencies, or especially MDBs, like a deal. When we did the wind power project in Egypt, the support, the collaboration with EBRD or IFC were very, very important. And well, more specifically about blend financing, it is really challenging for us. We once put some money in the fund which finances renewable energy project. So we took a catalyst role in taking the first loss so that more private industries come in. But after all, we weren't quite sure how much we were catalytic, because you never know whether we have just financed those projects that were commercially viable anyway, or let them make more profitable, less risky. But I'm not saying I am averse to blended finance. We take advantage when there are those who can give grants or concessional money. When they did project financing in some of the Pacific islands, well, those projects in Pacific Islands are very, very difficult, but in telecommunications, some project can be commercially viable. So we provided finance, but US and Australian counterpart brought some concessional money, which made our project viable. And in the case of many Asian countries, there are a lot of potential for geothermal projects as renewable energy. But the geothermal project is often very risky because you never know until you start, you can get enough heat or enough steam. And in the case of one project we did in Indonesia, we asked for the ADB to provide some fund from their trust fund, which comes from the grant of the member countries. And now we are doing another project in Germany, which uses closed-loop geothermal system, which just needs just heat, not steam. It's an innovative project, so that the commercial banks are not still reluctant to offer to be in the project, which is the very first commercializing project. So, and we as an official bank got in there because the Japanese companies were one of the sponsors, and hopefully the second or third project will be fully commercialized. So we will continue to take advantage of whatever blended finance there are. But for me, if you have a grand design of big blended finance, the solution comes. I'm not quite sure about it. I have to look at each transaction. I am less of a person of principle of good design, but I am a transactional person.
That's very clear. So not a general fix, but case by case, let's have a look. Well, let's hear the other perspective. Leila, I mean, the financial market infrastructure players like stock exchanges are a fundamental part of this architecture that we want to transform. Stock exchanges are the key intermediaries. They facilitate liquidity. They enhance market transparency. What do you think are the key ingredients? What are some of the examples of the reforms, regulation frameworks that Novo was talking about? But also, I know that you are part of the UN Alliance of Global Investors for Sustainable Development. What are the findings of the alliance?
Thanks, Sarah. And I think you opened with this comment around the gap for funding for SDGs, and it's actually $4.5 trillion US. And if we look over the last decade, the deals that have been done through blended finance amount to $200 billion US. So you can see that we're falling far short. And some of those issues that you raised in your opening remarks are really driving this. And so the perception of risk, and that's underpinned by potential political instability, currency risk, policy uncertainty, the lack of scale. The Convergence State did a study, and on average, blended finance deals are sitting at around $50 million US. The commercial institutions, their mandate and their entry level is $100 million. So more needs to be done to scale up. And then, of course, the complex deal structures where you're trying to get public players working with private players. And so as some of you may have read Stefan Durkon's book, where he talks about how countries who have enabled public-private sector collaboration have increased the size of the economic pie relative to those who have funded separately. And he uses the term the developmental bargain. And so as an exchange, and I see our central bank governor is here, and some of our commercial finance industry people are here too. And so what we are working at in our financial infrastructure is to try and overcome some of those. So the first problem of perception of risk, and Odile, you had mentioned concessional finance, guarantees, etc. Those do go a long way, but as you say, more needs to be done. So on scaling up the finance, standardized frameworks are required. At the JSC, we've introduced a number of green financing debt products, so green bonds, impact bonds. We spoke a little bit earlier about some of the decarbonizing initiatives, and we've created transition bonds to make sure that we don't have stranded assets, but that those institutions who are wanting to close down coal-related plants and therefore then build renewable projects can also have access to that sort of funding. In addition to that, in terms of the accelerators, consolidated guarantee structures are required, and concentrated catalytic funding is required, and we're seeing some tremendous work. And of course, you really need a crisis to catalyze this, and renewables is really at the center of that. And so we need to see more products that are really implemented at scale. And we are starting to see the beginning of that, but I think much more needs to be done. In South Africa, now some of those points that I've raised have really been on the global stage in my interaction on the UN Global Compact Board and the UN GISD Board. Globally, the Alliance have created a blended finance structure. Locally within South Africa, we do have a number of very good examples. The Gautrain funding was funded off a blended finance, equity, private equity and private debt structure, together with some concessional finance from government and MDBs. And what we are starting to see is a bit of an acceleration, and issues like in South Africa, the power crisis, a looming potential water crisis, generate a coalition of the willing. And we've also seen some very powerful public-private sector coalitions, which I can talk a little bit about later, which have galvanized and really started to create a platform for scaling up.
Great, and I think it is these coalitions that is something we need to understand in more detail, because I think this is where the promise is. And John, this is a perfect segue for you, because PKA has brought together a coalition that is experimenting with a really interesting blended finance model, because you've worked with the Investment Fund for Developing Countries of the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with other investors, to launch this Danish SDG investment fund, which has done quite well to mobilize capital for SDGs in emerging markets and developing economies. Tell us more about it. Tell us what the secret ingredient of this success story is and whether it can be replicated.
Yeah, for sure, I think it can be replicated. So PKA is the largest labor market pension fund in Denmark, and my members are the healthcare and social workers of Denmark, and they want, of course, and I need to also ensure that they have the highest possible return so they can have as high pensions as possible. But they also want to do good in the world, so there's sort of a double thing that we have to live up to if we can. So what we have done is that together with the Danish government, we made a coalition consisting of two very important ingredients. The first ingredient is that the Danish government will take the first risk. So that makes it possible for us to enter projects that might have a too high risk if we were to go alone. So if we had to do these investments alone. So the Danish government ensures the first risk. It is also deferred returns and so on. So it's a whole capital structure that ensures that we can actually invest also in emerging and developing economies. That's the one thing. The other thing is that the Danish government, and of course on the back of our investments, set up a whole team that can actually do these types of investments. Being a Danish pension fund, I mean, we would never have the competences or the ability to build our own team that can do these type of investments. It's too complex. You need local skills. You need, and as we just heard, what about currency risk, political risk, and all of that? That you need a special entity that actually take care of that part as well. And that's what the Danish government decided when we decided that we would invest alongside with the Danish government. And it's actually located very closely linked to the foreign minister, so they have all the access to all the diplomacy and so on, so they can ensure. We closed the first fund 7 years ago, and it is fully invested now, and now we actually open up the second fund. And also with some experiences, I mean, some investments were good, some were maybe not. And now we have a team with the skills and the knowledge of how to do these type of investments. So I very much look into this next phase of the SDG fund of Denmark.
Great. Now I'll come back to you, because you sounded a bit skeptical about this blended finance market. But do you envisage, JB, to do something along the lines John is describing, to scale, creating this mechanism so that these coalitions can do more and more of this?
Well, I'm quite ready, and It's very interesting. Well, in the Asian context, I know how to play the game. We know very well those institutions in Asian government, and Japanese companies are in many countries. But in the African context, for example, we see much less Japanese companies. We have much less relationship with host government. So I would very much like to work with people like you, or EBRD, or African Development, or other agencies who know the system and who know who to talk with.
John, what do you think needs to change on the side of more public money to really get more investors to do what you're doing? Are pension funds a special case, or can other investors do what you do?
I think other investors can also join, I'm sure, and I know it's the hope of the Danish SDG fund to get other investors on board, so family offices and so on. I think pension funds has a very long-term perspective on investments, and that gives them a special angle on this, that so they can think 10, 20, 30 years ahead, and I think that's very important. You also asked before, what is sort of the secret to make this work? I think it's trust. I mean, the government trusts that we won't, of course we need our returns, but we won't sort of, go too far to get our returns. Back to some of the projects, could they, be viable just as projects without some risk capital from the government, or could they not? So, I mean, there's a lot of trust within that system, and also trust from the pension funds to the Danish government that, they can set up a team that actually works more or less like a private equity setup, and that they will be able to eventually sell off some of these projects, and then we will get our returns. And they actually succeeded in that. So I think trust is a very important part here. I mean, we need to trust each other to do this, and somebody has to move first. And I think we talked to the Danish government, and they talked to us, and then I don't know who moved first, but we moved together and made it possible.
Odile, a big part of the conversation over the past 2-3 years to try and leverage more capital towards the SDG financing gap, but also now the target that was set at COP29 last year around the more blended finance hinges on the reform of the multilateral development banks. It's been this process that we've followed for a while now, led by the G20, that really expects an operational model that supports this kind of partnership. Can you tell us a little bit what has been achieved so far, what progress has been made in this respect, and what is still to come, and what we need to do?
Well, before doing that, I would like to really react to and build upon what has been said about pension fund and so forth, because what I found interesting is that in your case, you have a first loss from the government. What we try to do is and what we are succeeding in doing is working with some pension fund asset managers in Europe. We have a fund with ILX, for example, based in Netherlands, where they do some co-investment with us without guarantee. And I think because the level of risk of the project, because of the project preparation, the quality of, our involvement in the project, the selection of the project and so forth, you can have some investment in emerging markets, in renewable, or in which are investable by asset managers without a guarantee. And I think that's the question, and where we need to be careful about blended finance is that we need to go as far as we can in bringing private sector without guarantees in our markets, because this is where you have the scale. You need guarantees in some areas when it's very first technology, very risky project and so forth, but you will never have the scale to have guarantees for the trillions we are looking for. So being very selective and avoiding distorting the market where you provide guarantee where it's not needed, and really focusing on where you need this type of guarantees, and this is key. And to be able to do that, and to bring more private investors in without guarantee, quality of the project preparation, transparency of the data, and I think that's something we are working. Part of the reform agenda of the MDBs is being published much more our data about the losses, the risk of default and loss in default and so forth. And the outcome is very good. The result, we have the the gap between the risk perception and the reality of the risk is huge. It doesn't mean that you don't have risk, but in many cases you have a big gap. So I think that the more we can convey this message, show our data and so forth, the best it will be. Then in terms of the other dimension of the reform, I mean, we have worked all of us a lot on leveraging our capital, being able to take more risk. Increase our balance sheet and push the boundaries, not being too conservative. Take into account the preferred, we have preferred creditor status plus callable capital. So this is, and then you've seen quite a big increase of MDB's capacity. But the third component is a bit linked with the first point, is I think that all MDBs now are also moving to a model where the more we can share with the private sector, the better it is. So we do this kind of partnership with asset managers. We are working on synthetic securitization where because the scale is a big issue for private investors, and we try to do big projects, but sometimes you have small projects. So linking to all these projects, putting that on the market with securitization, that's a way to attract and also to accustomate, get private investors used to invest in emerging countries where you have this kind of bonds with synthetic risk, already quite a lot of diversification and so forth. And the last point I want to make is the concept of moving from project to project approach to a more policy, platform approach and policy pipeline approach. And to do that, for example, country platform, we have been talking a lot about that, is rather than each MDB looking at one project in one country, really working with the country on what is the plan, what is the objective, what is the strategy, and then have a pipeline of investment and have a bulk of money and then this is a way also to, have a common strategy, common platform, and share the investment pipeline. And then you bring more interest from donors because you have more clarity. But also you have a lot of efficiency gains from the beneficiary country that doesn't have to manage a one-to-one project, and from our perspective. So I think moving from this project to a sort of more strategic approach is a very important element of the evolution, and working together.
Great. Leila, from the perspective of South Africa and emerging markets, what are the key lessons that you can share with other emerging markets of how you've created a conducive investment ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got some very exciting projects and initiatives that are underway. Maybe before I start there, just to build on what Odila was saying, and I do agree that consolidated guarantee structures are not going to be enough to address the first loss and the lack of collateral project processes. If you look at all of the MDBs, they've got very anemic balance sheets. But that said, the ODI has put out a report indicating that only 45% of that funding is being allocated. So I do think that more needs to be done to leverage those balance sheets on a consolidated basis. In South Africa, we've seen quite a material transition, and John, you spoke about trust as a key cornerstone. South Africa's faced congenital mistrust between public and private sector in the environment of macroeconomic headwinds over the past decade. We established a new political regime in June of last year, which has created a genuine point of inflection, and our president has spoken at this platform a couple of times about what's happening there. What we've done is tackled the need for funding and the execution of policy across a number of areas. So firstly, on the insurance side, a number of changes have been made by our regulators to shift the categories of investment that are regulated to encourage pension funds and asset managers to allocate to infrastructure projects and to non-standard environments. I think more needs to be done for those institutions to take that up, but we're starting to see the groundwork. In addition, we have faced a national crisis of power security and are also facing water shortages. And this has created a tremendous coalition of the willing where we've started to see a genuine trust build up between our public and private sector. In the private sector, we have all of the large companies, over 150 of the largest organizations called the CEO Initiative. We are focused on addressing power security, the logistics security, and general safety and security. And there's a new work stream focused on growth now. We have been engaging government on financial initiatives to unlock growth, and one of the key underpins of that is public-private sector collaboration in funding. And so we are starting to see the building blocks of genuine growth. Government have created very important enabling policy. They've created the ability for, which is an enormous ideological shift from a previously very centrist state-owned entity environment to a more enabling and transformed state-owned entity situation. And they've created tax incentives for renewables, which has generated a genuine willingness by corporates to start to invest. They've also encouraged private individuals to start to invest in renewables. And all of these funding structures are shifting towards a more blended environment. The JSC itself has created a number of platforms. Firstly, we created a private placement environment, which is a market infrastructure to create a slightly more standardized terms and conditions for private equity. So it's a bit of a hybrid between public and private equity or capital raise. And we've had 46 new projects, many of which are in the renewable space, starting to seek funding. We are also in engagements with a number of our state-owned entities to look to potential funding, which would likely be blended finance, including concessional finance, public listed debt, and in some instances the possibility of even equity listing either of subsidiary entities or projects. And so overall what we are seeing is, I'm proud to say that the country is actually leading the way in the emerging markets, and South Africa has a mercurial way of really reacting very well to a crisis. And so I think the power crisis, which has now, I'm very pleased to say, profoundly turned around. We have not had any of the rolling blackouts that our country was becoming so used to for at least 10 months. And more than 10 gigawatts of power has been funded through our national energy regulator. And so I think what we are creating at the tip of Africa is a blueprint that other emerging markets can leverage off. There are, of course, many other funds that we have across the continent where we collaborate with other international players. So, for example, the Emerging Market Africa Infrastructure Fund, companies like Standard Bank, Allianz, the Dutch and the German central banks are all funding initiatives to crowd in and to accelerate on a consolidated basis to address the small number, the small value of transactions. And so all in all, I think we're taking a very multifaceted and systematic approach. But I come back to John's point, the underpin of this is trust and building a level of cooperation and a coalition of the willing between public sector, private sector, and of course the MDBs.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I'm actually quite struck that none of you has mentioned credit rating agencies, and and the role that they play in all of this, because they're fundamentally in pricing risk. We've seen in a lot of the work at ODI, the role that they do play, stifling perhaps the ability of the MDBs when it comes to the capital and how to, to really spread the capital a bit farther. But also markets that they don't necessarily know well, and the way they price risks is sometimes really stifles the investment. We don't have much time, but a quick reaction on that.
Yeah, very quick, and it's a favorite topic of mine. And if you look at the numbers, the UN has put out a report indicating that more than 90% of emerging markets raise their debt through, and this is low-income countries, in hard currency. And if you look at the facts, the FCI has put out a report indicating default rates of 3.5% for emerging markets, recovery rates of 70%. The Standard & Poor's overall global default rates are 3.5%, so comparing to 3.4%, and the recovery rates are even lower. And so I think the problem that Africa and many low-income and emerging markets are facing is that the qualitative overlay that rating agencies apply to the ratings, whether it be their perception of political uncertainty, policy instability, is overrated. And moreover, the problem that when countries have addressed their underlying debt problems, the time to re-rate is much longer. And so you have a circular effect where these countries are reliant on hard currency funded debt. They're paying on average 25% these are the low-income countries in Africa on their debt, and so it creates a vicious circle of the higher likelihood of debt. It really does need to be addressed, and there's a lot that's happening. There's a coalition between the African countries to start to advocate and address. I personally am working very strongly on the UNGC to ventilate this, and the Secretary General has responded to it, and he's actually met with the international rating agencies, and we're hopeful that there will start to become a genuine focus on credible and quantitatively based ratings, which of course determine the cost of funding.
Yeah, 100%. Do you want to add anything? No. Okay. Well, we have really 2 minutes, but in 30 seconds each, there's a question I often ask when I moderate panels at the annual meeting. We'll be back here in a year's time, annual meeting 2026. Between now and then, what is the one thing that you really hope will have changed? The one thing that can really contribute to scaling up this blending promise? Who wants to start?
So, okay, should I start? Okay, I think what I really hope for is that the structure that we have developed, the Danish pension funds and the Danish government, we could transfer that to, and maybe get some of the MDBs to do first losses, risk capital, and so on. Maybe we can scale it to even more. I would really hope for that to happen. And then, of course, what I will do, personally myself, I'll get more pension funds in Denmark to invest in the SDG fund, so it can be even bigger. It's small, but one step by step, it might be bigger.
We'll hold you to that.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we need success on the ground in order to build trust, as he said. We have to show that it is working. We need more ODA. We need much less debt. We need more technical assistance. But unless we have a successful example on the ground, we can't build trust among those people on the ground or for the potential investors. So we will work. Continue work.
Excellent.
So my hope is firstly that sovereign rating agencies begin to rate based on the genuine underlying risk rather than the qualitative perception. And then secondly, that as a country we have scaled up and are able to deliver on our infrastructure needs, both within South Africa and more broadly into the continent.
Excellent, and Odile.
And I have two wishes. The first one is to find partners like pension fund that to co-invest with us and to be able to demultiply what we are doing. And the second one is to develop more country platforms. So to have more this kind of strategic approach with the countries where we really agree on a plan and then we deploy it, and it's much quicker, much faster, and at a higher scale.
Fantastic. Well, the title of the session was Blended Finance, Broken Promise, but I really think that this fantastic panel has left you with a lot of inspiration about how we can fix that promise and make sure that we really scale blended finance to support sustainable development. Please join me to thank very much our fantastic panelists.